Re-editing, reworking, and reframing the story of what happened in Amsterdam. We examine the Western news outlets that bent their journalism Israel's way once again. Some headlines really do need fixing.
The reality is most people don't read beyond them.
The American academic who's on the case. Plus,
take over, Elon!
Donald Trump and Elon Musk. Is that anyone's idea of a dream team? In the wake of that ugly eruption of violence on the streets of Amsterdam, the media coverage of the story has been put under the microscope, and for good reason. Clashes that were triggered indisputably by Israeli football fans chanting genocidal slogans against Palestinians have somehow come to be described as acts of anti-Semitism. We are zeroing in on the work of two outlets in particular, the New York Times and the British broadcaster Sky News. Their journalists and editors were tripping over themselves, changing headlines, re-editing video, turning, in Sky's case, some initially objective reporting into selective and misleading storytelling that verged on disinformation. But the pro-Israel bias of Western news outlets on stories pertaining to Israel's brutal war on Gaza is not exactly breaking news. The beautiful game comes with an ugly side. Football hooliganism and racism is often part of the mix. Geopolitics and the coverage of it has a more civil face. Unlike the diplomats, the talking heads and news editors do not wear the team colors, but they too have their allegiances.
What do you worry events like this, attacks like this, tell us about growing anti-Semitism across the globe?
We saw football, geopolitics, and media malpractice come together that night in Amsterdam.
You know, this story that happened in Amsterdam is a perfect example of why public trust in the media continues to erode. You had very different versions of what actually took place on the ground, and it showed the way that Israeli talking points are promulgated by the mainstream media.
This is going to be a case study for journalist students, for media students, for years to come, especially the Sky News edit, which I guess we'll talk about.
Sky is a 24/7 news channel based in the UK. There were two versions of the digital report that Sky posted on the violence, the clashes between fans of the Israeli team Maccabi Tel Aviv and Dutch residents. Sky deleted its first report, re-edited it, and then published another account, which it called a correction, one it said was needed to add balance and impartiality. That is not unusual when news breaks. Typically, that second report, the rewrite, will include context that is missing in the first story. But that is the opposite of what Sky did.
In the first report that Sky News put out, there was a lot of context about the provocations that happened, the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans and the anti-Arab slurs.
Of Maccabi fans were filmed singing racist and anti-Arab songs.
How the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans were also attacking Dutch citizens, footage of them taking up steel pipes, wooden planks, all of that. In the second version of the report, all of a sudden the headline had the word anti-Semitism in it.
An entirely new report came on that basically said that the opposite had happened, that anti-Semitic mobs in Amsterdam had attacked innocent Israelis and that they were motivated by anti-Semitism.
It's the same feeling that I felt in the morning of the 7th of October.
If you had watched the first report, you would have an idea of what actually happened. And if you watched the subsequent report, you would have a completely distorted and inaccurate view of what really happened in Amsterdam.
People are being gaslit into accepting pro-genocidal, really right-wing narratives. Football hooligans come to a European city and engage in vandalism, violence, and racism. In this particular case, the existence of user-generated content has been really helpful. A 16-year-old young Dutch journalist, he essentially followed these Maccabi Tel Aviv fans, watching them engage in violent acts. That video became a key source for people trying to debunk and counter those mainstream media narratives. But crucially, not only will European leaders and media ignore this, they will lead us to believe that those responsible are the Arabs living in Europe and anyone critical of Israel.
Unacceptable act.
And the European leader, Ursula von der Leyen, the mayor of Amsterdam, have all condemned their own population and not the Israeli fascist right who came and committed violence, right? And if we criticize it, not only will we be ignored, we get blamed for condemning that.
No comprehensive study of the Western media's failings in the coverage of Israel, Gaza, and now Amsterdam is complete without a mention of the New York Times. Despite video evidence and eyewitness accounts of Israeli football fans inside the stadium and on the streets chanting things like, the Times produced this story online and in print, framing the clashes as anti-Semitic. And the headline kept changing.
They made it seem like the visiting Israelis were entirely victims. The story ran on the front page, okay, of the print edition, but you had to get to the inside page 7 and the 7th paragraph, which basically said there had been some provocation by the Israeli fans the night before. And then it returned after 1 or 2 paragraphs saying that back to the theme of anti-Semitism and the Israelis as victims.
They went to 4 or 5 different iterations of it, always trying to put anti-Semitism right into the headline of the story. And their only source for that anti-Semitism was either the Israeli prime minister, the Israeli president, or the prime minister of Holland. But if you actually read the article, the only verified instances of the attacks were anti-Arab sentiments and chants that were said by these hooligans.
The fact that liberal media, including very good media, New York Times is not some random outlet that has kind of made a journalistic mistake, is so easily falling into these tropes, shows the moment that Israel says something is anti-Semitic, then people just take that and say it's anti-Semitic and it's done. And then we have the toolbox ready of how to condemn it.
We questioned the Times about the article and the headlines and got this boilerplate defense of its journalism in response. We have robustly covered the violence and incendiary behavior in Amsterdam, which authorities continue to investigate, including a detailed reconstruction of what we know so far. We are continuing to report. There was no mention of the ever-changing headlines, what that was all about. Terminology can be a critical component of reporting. One term used to describe this story was pogrom, which was trotted out by Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog and regurgitated by Dutch politicians and pro-Israel lobbyists. A pogrom is defined as a violent riot incited to massacre or expel an ethnic or religious group, particularly Jews. It is not typically used to describe clashes involving football fans with a violent reputation who land in a foreign country, tear down the Palestinian flags of people who actually live there, chant genocidal slogans, and are clearly spoiling for a fight. The word pogrom had absolutely no place in the coverage of this story, yet there it was.
This is very dangerous for people who actually have studied what pogroms are. The same week that this event happened in Amsterdam, you saw real pogroms in the occupied West Bank, settlers setting fire to the homes of Palestinians, to their cars. If you want to actually see what a pogrom is, turn your eye to the occupied West Bank, where you see settlers with the help of the Israeli army promulgating these pogroms.
Violence around football matches is not something that is unique to Israel, Palestine, right? But the fact that this is just exported abroad with no sort of filters just shows how normalized it is here. You would expect people to be like, okay, now I'm in a big European capital. Maybe I shouldn't chant my racist chants, but that completely slips everyone's minds. There's this constant self-victimization of like the eternal Jew that is always the subject of anti-Semitism and is always the person who receives violence and never enacts violence.
Tonight, a violent...
Returning to the context that was missing in the initial coverage of the story in the Netherlands, the provocative behavior of those Israeli fans. The irony is that such newsy context gets overshadowed by an historical context from 80 years ago, the World War II Holocaust. That was a European story, and its censorious effects linger. In the collective guilt of the countries where it happened then, to the indefensible characterization by politicians and news outlets of what is happening now, be it in Amsterdam or Gaza. Another irony, sometimes it takes a voice in an Israeli newspaper to explain to Europeans what they are seeing on their own soil.
Gideon Levy wrote in Haaretz that the Amsterdam violence was an exercise in the perennial Israeli attempt at self-victimization. Israelis are basically taught to see themselves as the victims from a very early age, to evoke World War II, Nazism, Holocaust, genocide, European guilt, in order to shut down any legitimate criticism of what Israel are doing. And that's what it comes down to, right? It's propaganda, and it's designed to inflame and to censor.
This is feeding intergenerational trauma. But for Israelis, there's never anyone else's intergenerational trauma. It's not about Palestinians and the trauma of the Nakba and that being reenacted constantly. And it's only us, we're the constant victims. It's our grandparents in Europe escaping from the Nazis. It's always the genocide that was enacted on us 80 whatever years ago. It's never a genocide that we're now enacting in broad daylight.
A rapid-fire series of announcements has been pouring out of Donald Trump's office this past week as he forms his team for his second stint at the White House. One appointment has been that of one of his loudest cheerleaders, Elon Musk. Meenakshi Ravi is here with more.
Throughout the last few months of the US presidential election campaign, it was clear to anyone following the very public courtship between Donald Trump and Elon Musk that the two were going to have an ongoing relationship. That political partnership has now been made official. Trump has appointed the owner of X to be the co-lead of a brand new Department of Government Efficiency. The new office will take a hatchet to federal bureaucracy, regulations, and expenditures. However, it will operate outside of government. Musk has said he thinks he can deliver $2 trillion worth of cuts from the federal budget.
Your money is being wasted, and the Department of Government Efficiency is going to fix that.
The acronym of the new department, DOGE, has its own backstory, designed to amuse Trumpists, cryptocurrency enthusiasts, and Musk fans. Dogecoin is a form of cryptocurrency which Musk frequently promotes and holds significant financial interest in. With a dog as its mascot, Dogecoin is also called the first meme coin, that is, a form of currency born out of an internet joke, a meme. That would make the Department of Government Efficiency the first federal advisory organization to be memed into existence. Unfunny jokes aside, there is cause for some serious concern about this new department. Musk's various companies hold contracts worth billions of dollars with the US government, and Musk has repeatedly complained about federal agencies throwing the rule book at them. Now, with the power to influence regulatory cuts and redirect spending, Musk is in a position to enrich himself even further, while saying that it's America he's making great again.
Thanks, Meena. Throughout Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, critics have been tearing apart the media coverage, especially by news outlets in the United States. The never-ending inaccuracies, the repetition of Israeli talking points, and the critical absence of context. Such failings jump out at us because they often come in the form of headlines. Copywriters commit all kinds of journalistic sins and sometimes try to justify them by saying that headlines must be brief. But the end product is incomplete, misleading text that is frequently at odds with the reporting that follows. And since many readers never get past the headlines, the misinformation they contain can have an effect on perceptions. One historian, Asal Rad, has been on a journalistic mission to fix those headlines. She's been tweeting them out with strike-throughs, annotations, critiques, and corrections. Her work has gone viral because it is so on point. We spoke with Asal Rad about how an American academic has found herself patrolling a small but significant corner of the Fourth Estate, the world of headlines.
My name is Asal Rad, and I am a historian of the modern Middle East. And since the beginning of this war, and actually before this war, I have been correcting headlines. As a historian, I know how important narrative and storytelling is. And the way that this story is being told, in the Western media especially, is not right, and it's not accurate. So I tend to focus on headlines because the reality is most people don't read beyond them. Often news content is paywalled, or people just don't have that much time within their day to dedicate to every topic. Headlines do catch the eye though, and they shape the way that people think about these issues. The framing of stories on Palestine and Israel in the Western world, and particularly the US, has always been very one-sided. These headlines and stories, the way they're written, the use of language, it's all deliberate and all intentional. And I wanted people to see how a simple change of words could improve the way these stories are framed and the journalism behind it. One pattern I see so often is headlines that whitewash Israel's culpability in war crimes by not even mentioning the word Israel. An original headline from the New York Times reads, "Strikes pound Rafah, flatten large mosque." And this is an older headline. There's so many issues with this one. But let's start with the most glaring. Which force is behind the strikes? It's Israel, right? So why is that not mentioned? It's an omission, and that omission is not accidental because you see a pattern of it happening. Then strikes. You could have added 3 letters and made it very clear that they were in fact airstrikes. There's a mention of Rafah, but no reference to the fact that it's in Gaza, that Gaza is a part of the Palestinian territories, and this might confuse people who aren't knowledgeable about the entirety of the geography. You know, there might be a counter-argument that says, well, all of those details are what the entire article is for. The headline doesn't have to give all of that away. But you see that the addition of just a few words makes it very easy to bring the context into the headline. And then you can explain the details in the body of the piece. But this headline in its original form is so problematic because it attributes basically nothing to no one. You're not clear where this is taking place, you don't know what exactly happened, and you have no clue who did it.
Thursday's attack has been described as a massacre of civilians. Hundreds of starving Palestinians had gathered to collect food aid when they were attacked.
So this headline was published after the Flower Massacre, which happened in February of this year, where we saw really horrifying footage of Palestinians killed while trying to get food. The headline reads, "In chaotic scene, many are killed and wounded as Israelis open fire," which is just an absurd way of phrasing what happened. So one of the first problems with this phrasing is it makes it seem like chaos is inherent to the situation because it's Gaza, not because of the external forces, specifically the Israeli forces, that are causing the situation. Also, it wasn't a chaotic scene, it was a massacre. And to call it a chaotic scene is just an obscene way of talking about it. The headline also says, "Many are killed and wounded." They've used passive voice to describe a situation in which more than 100 starving people who are being deliberately starved, were killed. Israeli forces opened fire on them as they were trying to get food from the aid convoys. That's what happened. When you look at reporting from other conflicts, like Russia's war against Ukraine, you see the difference in language used very quickly. In this headline, how Russia is using Ukrainians' hunger as a weapon of war. You can see very clearly there's no passive voice. Russia is named as the responsible party, and the crime that is being committed by Russia is stated clearly in plain English. Also, Ukrainians are named as the victims. If you notice, I underlined that line, residents of Mariupol, Ukraine, because that's not how Palestinians in Gaza are talked about. Writers use Gazans rather than Palestinians. So Ukrainians in a specific location in Ukraine are still called Ukrainians, but in the case of Gaza, too often there are no references to Palestinians. And this goes back to the idea of how, not just in the media, but also in our political discourse, Palestine is fragmented. People might not understand that Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem. They're all part of a Palestinian state. They're all Palestinian territories. And if you single out Gazans without explaining that they're Palestinians, you're essentially separating Gaza from the larger issue of Palestinian statehood and liberation. And this falls into an Israeli pattern of erasing Palestinian identity and Palestinian statehood by treating each of these illegally occupied territories and their people as separate entities. People in Gaza are Palestinians, and journalists should call them that. I share a lot of headlines from The Onion. It's a satirical news site in the US, and their headlines are supposed to be a joke. They're supposed to be humorous exaggerations that sort of put a mirror up to society and politics, and especially the way that our own media covers events. But some of The Onion's older posts on this particular issue, on Israel-Palestine, and the US's role in it, they almost read like predictions. We've come to the point where the situation with Gaza has become so atrocious that The Onion's headlines have become pretty spot on. This headline reads, "Netanyahu assures critics he still has the utmost respect for US money." And the context in which I shared it was that Netanyahu had canceled a visit by an Israeli delegation to Washington, D.C. because the US finally didn't veto a ceasefire resolution at the United Nations. They did everything, and this was back in March of this year. They did everything to undermine the resolution still by calling it non-binding, but they didn't actually veto it. But Netanyahu wasn't so upset that he turned down the $3.3 billion in taxpayer dollars that the US is giving Israel to fund its wars. He was very quick, in fact, to thank America for that money. Mind you, this Onion headline is from originally 2015, when the Obama administration was at odds with the Netanyahu government. But despite those very clear disagreements, Obama still handed Israel a $38 billion package of military aid over 10 years that was the largest of its kind. Years later, the Onion's headline is still applicable because Netanyahu is still in power. He's still snubbing the US and undermining US policy and international law, and he's still getting billions of dollars, which he's happy to get. When you talk about a mask-off moment, Gaza has really shredded anything that resembles the sort of world order that we had become accustomed to hearing Western powers, especially the United States and mainstream media in the US, champion for such a long time. And they're still using that language, but with such an egregious level of hypocrisy that everyone can see it now. And I think that's the part that's resonating with so many people with these headline corrections. The state of Israel seems to be able to get away with anything, and not be held accountable. And the fact that the media is so complicit in this process, that it continues to whitewash Israel's crimes and parrot basically whatever the US's official line is, it's a real abdication of its role. And these incomplete, inaccurate headlines are shaping how people think, and that's why I think it's so important to point it out.
And finally, Israel's war of annihilation in Gaza has got broad support from senior European media figures who repeatedly refer to Israel's right to defend itself. But every now and then, one of those journalists lets slip how they really feel. Ulf Poschardt is the editor-in-chief of one of Germany's top newspapers, Die Welt. He had one of those moments this past week when discussing the chaos on the streets of Amsterdam.
Diese Szene, dass dort wimmernd jüdische Bürger auf der Straße um ihr Leben flehen müssen, während irgendwelche Barbaren einfach so rufen, ja, Free Palestine, sagt das jetzt. Und das sind ja nicht nur Flüchtlinge oder irgendwelche Asylbeantragten, sondern das sind ja auch hochwahrscheinlich Leute dabei, die in der zweiten, dritten Generation hier. Wie gehen wir mit denen um?
How do we deal with them? Them being Dutch citizens, minorities, Muslims, people Poschardt clearly sees as a problem. The editor's framing was rooted in animosity towards Muslims, based on the idea that supporters of Palestine somehow represent an existential threat to Europe's way of life, to its values. And those values currently include upholding Israel's right to practice apartheid and to conduct a genocide. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.